Morning, Darcy. Good to see you. Buenos dias, Center. Morning, Janine. Folks, here's the agenda. For those of you who might not have it open in a tab. Claire. We're going to start in 1 minute. There's the sign-in link. Okay. Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third and final day of Themes in World History, Democracy and Power. We're really excited about today's workshop. We're going to be exploring the August Revolution in Vietnam. We're going to be joined by Alex Taivo, who's an amazing scholar and is going to talk to you about his scholarship and also his personal experiences with this particular topic. It is Friday, so that's a good thing. Got the weekend coming up. It's the second day of summer. Let's get into this. We've always started off with a land-grant institution because UCLA is built on indigenous land. And so as such, we acknowledge that the Tongva Gabrielino peoples are the traditional caretakers of the unceded land that was originally known as Tovangar, or currently the LA Basin to the Southern Channel Islands. I do want to just take a moment to let you know about the sign-in sheet. We've added 2 questions to the sign-in sheet. I want to direct your attention to those. The first one you'll notice is going to ask you about the book. If you are interested in the books that the book that we've been talking about, Bad Mexicans, and you would like a copy mailed to you, please answer that question with your name and address, and we will ship that out to you. And then the second one is about the lesson plan. And if you are interested in creating a lesson plan, just let us know. If you are registering or trying to register for the extension course, also just choose yes answer yes. Choose yes for that option as well. Happy Pride Month, everyone. This Pride Month takes on it's always a political month, but particularly in this context that we're in. And so we always encourage our teachers to incorporate the history of LGBTQ folks into different units of instruction. And we have lesson plans here to help you do that, providing opportunities for other students to see and learn about LGBTQ history is a great way to be an ally, to normalize this, and to support all students in learning more different perspectives of historical narratives that we traditionally teach. Okay, if you are new or this is your first day, just letting you know a little bit about us. We are the UCLA History Geography Project. We're collaborating on this with our partners from the International Institute. We're going to say hello in a few slides here. We are located at UCLA in the School of Education, or Moore Hall, and we're at Center X, which is a nonprofit that the School of Education runs. And at Center X, you will find different subject matter projects like the Science Project and the Writing Project. We're also part of a statewide network called the California History Social Science Project. All of us are former teachers. We've all been in education I've been in education for 21 years. And we believe strongly in collaboration with teachers to make history empowering and relevant for our students. This is some of our community collaborators. You'll see that we work with both districts and local archives, and also just various projects that come out of local communities, like the Belmar History and Art Project. And this is us, that's me there. Our associate director is a transitional phase right now. We are currently in search for an associate director. We're also joined here by Amparo. Amparo, if you want to say hi to everybody.
Good morning, everyone. So excited to be here to learn one more day.
Mark Anthony, our project manager, is not here with us, but he's amazing and was instrumental in getting all this organized. You might recall getting emails from him. These are our teacher leaders, and as it relates to this work, this work has been led by Vanessa Herrera. So Vanessa, you want to say hi?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Super excited to jump in it with you all today.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, and our friends at the International Institute.
Hi, everyone. I'm Noette, and I'm happy to be here. Welcome to Returning and New Educators. I'm with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies.
Thank you, Noette.
I'm here. I'm Joanna Romero. I'm from the Center for Near Eastern Studies with Cleo Sawehi, who some of you guys might have also gotten emails from about details on the course.
Thank you, Joanna. So this is a great collaboration. We've been collaborating with our friends Noette and Joanna for years now in the International Institute to provide professional development for world history teachers. So we've provided world history professional development for 6th grade, 7th grade, and this year, in the upcoming years, it's going to be focused on our high school 10th grade teachers. So we're proud of that collaboration, and we also really like enjoying working with each other. So that's an added benefit there. Okay, so I wanted to address some issues. I know that there has been some difficulty enrolling in the UCLA extension course. I've also heard that Sandra Gaspar's email in the contact might not be responsive. So what I've done is I've reached out to Sandra and I've asked her to provide some updates about enrollment. I need to let everybody know that this seems to be an issue across the board with UCLA extension right now. We're working on another project, and students in that project are also struggling to register for the course. So this might be on their end, and I wouldn't be surprised because this tends to happen from time to time. But if we don't have an answer before this workshop ends, please respond to the sign-in sheet and let me know that you do want to write a lesson. And also just let me know in the chat if you would like to do that you are trying to register and you can't. And I'll let Sandra know, and I'll be emailing those folks with updates when possible. I have heard that using different browsers could work. We gave that a shot this morning. One of our participants did, and it didn't work on the Firefox browser. So maybe it's just a finicky situation, but we are looking into that. Whoops. Yesterday, Amparo spent some good time talking about the lesson plan, provided you all some examples of some lessons that teachers have collaborated with us on in the past to give you a sense of what a final lesson looks like. The due date for this lesson is going to be, well, there's 2 due dates. The first draft, and I'll put this in the chat, is going to be on August 4th. Okay, and that is for draft 1. And this is for all teachers who want to create a lesson. And then the final draft is due September 1st. Okay. We're going to also provide opportunities for you all to meet with us if you choose to receive some feedback, some support, some coaching as you go in to start to design your lesson. Oftentimes you might have questions. And so we will also provide some dates probably via email to let you know about our availability to support the design of the lesson plan. Okay. Our agenda, I'm going to put it in the chat again. Okay, these are world history lessons. Okay, so this grant is funded with the idea that we are providing world history professional development with our partners at the International Institute. So unfortunately, we cannot take lessons focused on US history. All right, and before I pass it on, I just want to again create the sort of framework for this workshop. The framework comes from the California History Social Science Framework from 2017, which is looking to sort of update the content standards and ask teachers to take a more inquiry-driven approach that focuses on the development of historical literacies and concepts. One of the things that the framework recommends to all world history teachers is to explore their content through some themes. The themes recommended in the framework for world history teachers are interconnections, the environment, religion, philosophy, democracy, and power relations. So we decided with the series that we're going to emphasize some of those themes yearly as we present the content. So this year's content of revolutions, we really thought would be nicely aligned to democracy and power relations. And then the driving questions for the day. We have here the immediate and long-term causes and consequences of the August Revolution, how we could help students better understand the events through these themes, how we could teach about this in ways that engage and inspire. And today we also want to talk a little bit about how these revolutions help us make sense of some of the threats that we're seeing to democracy here in the United States. All right, continue asking those questions in the chat. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Vanessa.
Good morning, everyone. Before we really jump into the meat and the heart of, Danny, if you could go back one slide, please. Thank you. Before we jump into the meat and the heart of the August Revolution and all that we're going to do today, I want to provide us some time, even if it's just in the chat, to really think about and reflect on that last driving question and to reflect on the first two revolutions that we looked at. So here's your moment to really to share your thoughts, connections that you see between the first two revolutions that we talked about, connections that you were noticing between the Mexican Revolution and the Arab Spring, and ways in which learning about these and helping our students learn about these might help us make sense of us and our democracy and changes and shifts that we see happening today. So we'll give folks a minute to kind of like think about and digest that question. And I'd love to hear in the chat just some thoughts, what's coming up. Yesterday, kind of like we ended pretty quick. So we want to make sure that we give folks some time to reflect on what we were talking about yesterday and the previous day, and how these, how this learning might help our students reflect on their own lives, reflect on what's happening. A little bit of drum roll music there for us. Yes, I'm hearing that those revolutions were part of larger struggles, not just a single event. Yeah, both are about power of the little people, I would say, kind of like the everyday people, and affecting everyday people. We've got connections of foreign influence across both of those. So true about this access to food and economic inequality. The access to food piece, I think, is huge in both of those, in both of the revolutions that we looked at. We've got so many things coming in. People had lots of thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing. Similar causes, I think that there's a lot that could be done there with students to talk about and help them draw out similarities and causes across various revolutions of how each of them are unique, but that we do have so many of those, to borrow the term from one of us, recipes, ingredients that are part of that. The power from below, the abstinence of power. Like the seeing two different revolutions and two time periods helped me see the conversation around them and making sense of them as they're going, as making sense of them is ongoing. I like that piece as well, right? That thought of just people are still making sense of these revolutions. You know, that the professor the first day was talking about how historiography of the Mexican Revolution has changed and evolved, and how people are still going back to that same constitution is still being used and changed and amended. Yeah, how the August Revolution, we're still looking at it, it's still happening. think we'll see that as well with what we're talking about today, that the August Revolution is very much still being looked at today and affecting Vietnam and Vietnamese people in and outside of Vietnam as well. I appreciate ways in which these revolutions are presented as a continuum as opposed to having clear end dates. What were the main causes and consequences? What's the legacy today? Coalition building. Question 4, people saying question 4 is really interesting. Yeah, I think it's good for us to be able to help students see, or at least to begin to see how these historical events might relate to what we're doing. Thank you so much, folks. There's a lot going on there, but thank you so much for sharing that in the chat. It makes me think of how young people here have organized in the past and how they've organized recently around the environmental, social, racial issues, labor, COVID in their own countries, and what the pushback has been on social justice and progress. We're getting the question of how and why is it that threats to democracy persist today? The Declaration and Coding of Jefferson. Thank you, folks. I appreciate all of these thoughts as a reflection and just holding space for us to sort of like be able to digest all of this. We've got a lot of new information coming at us, progressive versus regressive forces. I really like that coming in there in the chat. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead then and start to dive in and shift to Vietnam and to today's warm up. Danny, if you can move it forward. Thank you. So here in the chat, again, we're going to go ahead and start thinking about these 2 questions. How do our current history textbooks address Vietnamese history? And how do we, or do we, teach about Vietnam in our high school classrooms? Let's go ahead and give that a few minutes to sort of think about and to go ahead and throw those answers in the chat as well. So when we initially met with the professor that we're speaking to today, when we officially met with him to talk about this, he posed this question to us. So what do history textbooks say about, what do US history textbooks say, or textbooks in the United States say about Vietnamese history? And Danny and I sort of looked at each other and we were like, well, not a whole lot. And we had a really hard time coming up with an answer to his question of like, what is said about Vietnamese history, right? I'm getting some good stuff in here, right? And Darcy, I'm with you that this was really new to me. I feel like I've had a crash course in Vietnamese history, and being someone who taught world history, being someone who taught US history, I had a really good understanding of the Vietnam War. And I thought that I had a pretty good understanding of sort of events leading up to that, but really learned to realize that I didn't know a whole lot about Vietnamese history. Colonization usually first, not much about Vietnam before. The hot war of the Cold War, not much. Barely a mention of the Cold War. Right up there with the Armenian genocide, right, of like the history that isn't told, the history that is hard to find. The image that you see there, I went in and I looked through the history textbooks that I have on hand with me. I looked through world history textbooks, I looked through US history textbooks, and although that is a really poor quality of a photograph, that first 2 paragraphs is all that I can find about Vietnamese history. In the entire textbook that I looked at, or in the series of textbooks that I looked like, that we're talking about actually what a Vietnamese perspective or anything about Vietnam, and not necessarily about the Cold War. Those 2 paragraphs, there was a whole unit on the Cold War, but not, right? It's a discussion of the context, perspective, from our perspective, the needs of US. Thank you so much. There's a lot coming in here. So it got me thinking about histories that aren't told, histories that aren't there, or histories that are difficult to find. And this and research on the August Revolution became that for me, a history that was really hard for me to find. Thank you. Danny, if you could go ahead and move that slide forward. So here I was on a search just to find an image of the August Revolution. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and it was kind of saddening to me that the best source of information that I could find on the August Revolution in English was in Wikipedia. I looked, those are all the different sort of sites where I could find information on the August Revolution. There were some on very specific kind of US pro-communist sites. There was a little bit of information, some images there. Everything was about the US involvement in Vietnam, all the things that I could find. Even in the Library of Congress, which is a huge library, I couldn't find information on the Proclamation of Independence. There's images about everything in the Library of Congress, and I couldn't find a single image of this particular event that is a very well documented event. The professor in the reading that he gave us even said that this was the second most researched event in Vietnamese history, right after the Vietnam War, or what they refer to as the American War. And still, it was very difficult for me to find. And so what I would like us to do today is to really find ways to center Vietnam in this history, to center the people there in our story, in the story that we're going to tell and the story that we're going to research. And to do that, I'm hoping to begin by looking at a primary source. So Danny, if you could go ahead and move it forward. Thank you. And so here is where we're going to start today. One of the things that we were given by the professor is an English translation of the proclamation given in 1945, the Proclamation of Independence. And so what we are going to do then, or this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to take a deep dive into that proclamation. I'll throw, sorry, I'm looking for the link here. We'll take a deep dive into the proclamation. What we're going to do is we are going to be in breakout groups of 2 in pairs. We'll spend 10 minutes taking a look at the proclamation, going ahead and taking a look at that and figuring out examples of power over, right? Oppression. What specifically does the document called out that they were rebelling against? What were what's the evidence of power over that the document is giving? And then looking at what types of power, Vietnamese power, what kind of power is being expressed in the document? Where do we see the people of Vietnam taking power? And how might this document help us to center Vietnamese in the history of this Proclamation of Independence? And so in just a minute here, we'll head off to our breakout rooms. There's the declaration there. There's 2 parts of it. The first is as a really abridged version. I recommend that you scroll down to that second page. And in that second page is a much longer version of the proclamation with much more detail in there, that second page right there. So we'll have 10 minutes to go ahead and read through that, to pull those things out. And then we'll have 10 minutes for you to discuss with your partner some of those questions. So folks, when we're ready, when those breakout rooms are ready, we'll send you off and to take a look at this proclamation.
Good.
Welcome back, folks. I was popping kind of in and out of rooms, and there were some really deep and really rich conversations there. I'd like to be able to open up the floor to be able to hear what it is that people were talking about here, to hear kind of connections that folks were making. In the rooms that I was in, people were really talking about that, of just what histories do we tell, what histories do we not tell, how we had seen this document, but only the first bit, and to really go through and read all the way through and look at everything that is in there. I would love to hear folks' commentary. Feel free to take yourself off mute and just speak or throw things in the chat. And really looking at where do we see, how could we use this primary source in the classroom? How could looking at this really center Vietnamese in this colonial struggle? I see a hand, but I can't see. Darcy, go for it.
Hi, I've had Diane and Anne, who are both English teachers, in my room. And we were kind of amazed at the declaration and how in a 20th century language, they really hit the complaints hard. Sorry, things just fell off my desk. But listing those complaints in such graphic and real and pragmatic language about how they've been treated. And then Anne and I thought, you know, that one line, the truth is that we have wrung back our independence from the Japanese hands and not from the French, when it's been French colonialism for so long. I thought was kind of amazing. And yeah, we want to bring in the things that our textbooks don't cover, right? Because history is written by the winners and not always complete.
Thank you, Darcy. Anyone else? How can we use this in our classroom? How could this help us to center Vietnamese voices, especially considering in Southern California, we have so many Vietnamese students in our classes where this is not just history, but this is their own personal family history. Their own family's immigration story can be directly tied to this history. What are our thoughts there? I'm hearing seen in the chat, the language would be easier for students to understand, but we ask, I'm not
like the way it was translated, Vanessa. Like if it's because of the way that it was translated, like students have a hard time with the American Declaration of Independence because the language is older, but if maybe this was easier to understand in part because of the translation itself, right? They put it into easier to understand language.
You know what? I can't speak to that piece of whether it's the translation itself. My guess, and this is just a guess out there, that this is written in, this is written in 1946. That it just may be that the language itself and that how people are speaking themselves is more updated, that it was written in something that is closer to how we would speak today, but that is just a total guess. It's something to ask the professor. I'm hearing people coming to the thinking that this can be taught in conjunction with the American Declaration of Independence. I see such parallels of just the way it is saying we believe in these rights, and then the laying out of grievances, like the format is super similar. Amparo shouting out there that, hey, this can be taught in Constitution Day. Time is editorial choices by those who write the history standards makes it and other histories difficult to incorporate to our curriculum. We had a big conversation in one of the rooms I was in of just like, hey, when can we, like, there are so many standards, the framework says this and that. Where can we fit this in? We had a conversation of like, hey, both the framework and the standards call out Enlightenment thinking, like here is Enlightenment thinking, like let's let go of the Glorious Revolution and let's look at Enlightenment through this document, or comparing this to the Declarations of Rights and Men of from the French Revolution. What else are we saying? It was intentional, even the way it's set up with the ideals about grievances below, specific examples of grievances. Ooh, compared to Ukraine. That is really interesting. Thinking about decolonization and imperialism would work really well. A call back to revolutions. Our standards do specific, or the framework does specifically call out to look at how colonies react to their imperialist rulers. And so this could be a direct reason right there. Surprised by the lack of reference to China. Some folks bringing up Ho Chi Minh and at the end of World War I. a cross-section of the Iroquois' Great Law of Peace, Declaration of Independence, and this document to question its self-determination, the American story of a story of the people. That could be super interesting. Lots of really, really great thoughts here. Would work extremely well when teaching decolonialization. Power 4, right? A new start for a country which aspires to practice the ideals of the French and the US founding documents. I definitely see that, right? We've got the whole list of power over, like here are all the systems of oppression, but throughout this whole document, you definitely get the spirit of, of that power 4 of like, this is the aspirational country that we wish to be, that agency in that writing itself. And how powerful would it be for, for all students, but particularly our Vietnamese students, to see these documents presented or this document presented alongside alongside the other documents that we teach or alongside all the other histories that we teach. And I'll open that up for any last comments that we might have here. All right, thank you. Well, thank you for taking a look at this document. Thank you for looking at this. Danny, I'm not sure if the professor is ready for us, if we're ready to introduce them.
Hi, Vanessa. Yeah, Dr. Taivo is here with us. We're excited. Alex, I made you co-host so that you can share your screen. But yeah, let's go ahead and do some proper introductions. Vanessa, thank you so much for leading that discussion, and everyone had an opportunity to read the Proclamation of Independence from the Republic of Vietnam. We had some really good discussions about that. So now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to our guest scholar for today. Really excited to hear from Dr. Alex Taivo. Some of his information is here on the screen, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our partner, Nguyen, who's going to do the introduction.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Nguyen, and I'm the Assistant Director of the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Alex Taivo is currently Assistant Research Professor at the Vietnam Center and Sam Johnson Vietnam Archive at Texas Tech University. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oregon. And Alex Tai is actually from Southern California. He grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, was one of us, and he received his BA at UC Berkeley. He got his master's at Cornell University, and he worked for a few years, and then he went back to Cornell to get his PhD in history. And it is at Cornell where Alex Tai and I met and bonded over the fact that we are both Vietnamese American Californians stuck in upstate New York while going to graduate school. So at Cornell, his dissertation examines the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's mass mobilization and land reform policies, exploring the rise of communist revolution in Vietnam and the violent transformation of the country from colonialism to communism between the years 1945 and 1960. He has published many scholarly articles on Vietnam, but most recently, he co-edited a book titled Towards a Framework for Vietnamese American Studies, History, Community, and Memory, Texas Temple University Press in 2023. He's also co-edited this volume that you see here in the slide as well. So Towards a Framework for Vietnamese American Studies is an edited volume that explores the ideologies, networks, and cultural sensibilities that have long influenced and continue to transform social, political, and economic developments in Vietnam and the US. It presents a new Vietnamese American historiography that began in South Vietnam and how legacy and memory is nurtured, produced, and circulated in the Vietnamese diaspora. But today, his talk will revisit some of his dissertation research and will focus on the August Revolution. So I just want to note that some of the images are graphic, so if you need to look away, feel free to do so. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alex Tai Vo.
Hey, thank you. Hey everyone, I think I saw some Red Raider, Megan, right?
Yeah, I went to Texas Tech, so happy to see you.
Same here. Let me try to share screen first, and then we'll get started. Can you guys all see?
Yes.
Right, and I believe I sent out the slides too for your reference, right? So obviously I'm not going to be able to go through every single details in the presentation, so you'll feel free to examine the slides, and if you have any questions, feel free to I'm sure that the organizer can share with you my contacts, and feel free just to reach out to me anytime that you need anything in terms of resources or information regarding Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and whatnot. But once again, thank you, Whit, and thank you, Danny, and thank you, Vanessa, for allowing me this opportunity to have a talk with all of you. It's a pleasure. As Whit said, I am a scholar of modern Vietnam, the Vietnam War, specifically North Vietnam and and Ho Chi Minh and his regime. So this topic is it's something that I've studied for over 20 years, since I was in an undergraduate at Berkeley. And just a brief bio about me, just so that you can kind of have a sense of where I'm coming from and how that might influence my view of history, Vietnamese history. I'm not shying away from it because I think it's important for all of us when we study history to kind of acknowledge who we are and where we're situated within the context of understanding history. And my background, to a certain extent, play a part in how I view and see Vietnamese history. And I rather than hiding that, I want to acknowledge that. I came to America when I was 8, after my father had been via the program known as HO, which is Humanitarian Organization Program. So it's a program that allows people who were former associate of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the side that the US supported during the Vietnam War. And so he was in prison for 7 years. So those who were in prison 3 years and above were able to come to America as refugees along with their family. And so I was the son of a Southern official who was in prison for 7 years. So I came to America in that sense. I didn't really have much of an interest in Vietnamese history to begin with. I had actually wanted to become either a lawyer to follow my father's pursuit, or actually I was more into philosophy. I wanted to be a philosopher. So when I was in high school, I was studying German, wanting to be studying German philosophy and whatnot. It wasn't until I was at Berkeley, I was taking a class from a professor who taught the class, and he kind of taught the class very one-sided from my perspective, obviously. And then so during midterm, I decided to write, instead of writing according to what the professor had asked, I wrote in asking the professor that for the second part of the semester, that he would be more equal in terms of presenting the different narratives about the Vietnam War and whatnot. And as a result, I think I shared this story to Whit and others already. but I got an F minus as a result of that request. And then a full page long response with many different comments saying that the reason I got my grade was because I didn't write according to how the professor was asking in the prompt. But at the end of the comment, he suggested that the reason why I made such a comment and critique of his teaching was because of my bitterness for being on the side of the losing side of the war and whatnot. And that became the reason why I decided to study about Vietnam, the Vietnamese history, as a way to understand my own history and why I'm here in America as a Vietnamese American, right? And so that's why I decided to go as far back as the early days of the Vietnamese quote unquote revolution, 1945. So the year that we are going to talk about today. So so I'm going to begin with that. Vietnam, 1945 August Revolution, triumphs and tragedy. And I think I have a purpose for using triumphs and tragedy. The reason is because often when we talk about the Vietnamese Revolution, be it the war against the French, be it the war against the Americans / South Vietnam, or be it the independence movement that led to the Declaration of Independence that you guys read, we often center on the success and on particular individuals. So I want us to kind of instead use the August revolutions as a way to look at the context, the causes of the events that led to the August revolutions, but also the consequences that resulted from the August revolution, as a way to understand history, because that to a large extent shape the reality of Vietnam today, but also shape the reality of individuals such as myself and Whit for being in America as Vietnamese American, right? So if we look at the August Revolution in isolation, we oftentimes do not understand that impact that it has 40, 50, or 80 years after, right? Prior to that, I would like to ask any of you if you recognize this picture, picture of these individuals holding these white papers. Do any of you recognize any? Just feel free to just say no. All right, so this is basically some pictures of last year's around November 2022's a series of protests that were occurring in mainland China against the COVID lockdown, and specifically the zero COVID policy implemented by the communist regime in China. A lot of the protesters, instead of coming out with different types of banner or saying and demands, they were standing there silently holding a white paper as a gesture of protest. The reason why I'm saying this, I'm using this, is because this event was pretty much covered by most of the international news in democratic and semi-democratic societies, with the exceptions of authoritarian societies such as China. And in Vietnam, it was prohibited. So newspaper, and people do discuss it on social media, but official newspapers couldn't talk about it, couldn't discuss it, which led to this quote that's kind of funny. It basically, it led to this one person challenging any newspaper that reports on the protests in China, I will treat the whole editorial team to a drink. And so he's kind of jokingly making fun of the situation. And another person, a retired journalist, responded by saying, "This dude is pretty true. He's making a bet fully knowing that he's going to win the bet, because no Vietnamese newspaper would cover such a news happening in China, because Vietnam has a very tight relationship with China, in a sense that it doesn't necessarily want to offend China by covering the story, and thus prohibiting most of the news in Vietnam from covering the protests. And the reason why I use this as a way of a contemporary issue for us to reflect back 80 years earlier, 1945, when Ho Chi Minh made that declarations of independence, right? Requesting or declaring that Vietnam from now on will have freedom and sovereignty and freedom, the desire for freedom and whatnot, as a way for us to see how things have changed or have not changed or have developed over time, and how that event in 1945 is still relevant to today in 2022-23, in how the Vietnamese government is ruling the state of Vietnam. So the talk will be, will be an hour long. I will divide it into two halves. The first, I will focus a little bit on the common narrative on the 1945 August Revolution, how people have often remembered it or talked about it, or how it's been taught. And then second, I will talk a little bit about the historical context that gave rise to the August Revolutions, as well as the context that resulted from it, the consequences of the revolution itself. Namely, I will talk about the uprisings and revolutionary movements during the French colonial period, and then the 1945 revolution, or some would call that a coup d'etat, and then, of course, the post-revolution events and consequences, the triumphs and tragedies that occurs. And then, as Nguyen said, some of the information in here or some of the picture might be a bit graphic, just to forewarn you, but the reason why I want to use them is because having a revolution is not easy, right? It's people sacrificing themselves, right? So it's a challenge that we rather than ignoring, we need to acknowledge, and that's the reason why I use some of those pictures. So some common narrative that when we talk about modern Vietnamese history, Ho Chi Minh or the August Revolution, is we often talk about this 2,000 years of history of Vietnamese resistance against foreign rule. Some people would push it as far back as 3,000 years, as 4,000 years, depends on who you ask. But there's this notion that Vietnam has this 2,000-year-long history of fighting against foreign aggressions, right? Be it the Chinese, the French, or the America, right? So it fits into this narrative, this general narrative of how Vietnamese succeeded in 1945, in 1954, and in 1975, right? And thus, Ho Chi Minh was always kind of depicted as kind of the only one who drew on that history, right? And it was able to stir up the national sentiment for people to rise up against the French and then against the Americans, right? And that is kind of represented through his declarations of independence by his referencing of Americans, the US declarations of independence, and his expressions of wanting to create a democratic government, right? And thus, the 1945 August Revolution is seen and is portrayed by most as a success, a representation of Vietnamese nationalist heritage enthroned upon Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party that he led, irrespective of what occurred then and afterward in terms of the post-revolution policies and failures under that regimes and under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, right? So oftentimes when we see of Ho Chi Minh, we only see that moment of him presenting that declaration and stating that his desire of creating a democratic government, but without really seeing whether that democratic government that he was pronouncing really live up to what he was pronouncing. So here is a timeline, a major timeline that you can see. The highlighted part all the major events that occurred in 1945. But prior to that, you see a list of other dates, a list of other years and events. And after that, you also see a whole list of other dates and events that I kind of condensed down to this. Obviously, I'm not going to, I'm not going to talk about all these today. It's not the point. But the point is for you to understand that since French colonizations of Vietnam beginning in 1858, right, in mid 18th century, 19th century, Vietnam has gone through various revolutionary movements, uprising against the French, trying to dethrone the French. The reason why I'm presenting it in such a way, and I would alert you to that, is because oftentimes when we talk about the revolution against the French, we concentrate on the success of the 1945 event and Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party. We ignore what happened before that and after that. We ignore not just the events that happens, but also the faces, the people involved in prior events leading up to that either inspire or give inertia to the event of 1945. As we can see here, from 1958, beginning in 1959, all the way up to 1945, there were multiple uprisings and revolutionary movement led by various different Vietnamese in Vietnam. And I think it's important to recognize that and have a deeper understanding of these movements. Is also crucial to understand the different meanings and purposes within these movements, as opposed to the communist movement that was led by Ho Chi Minh, or the nationalist movement that was led by Ho Chi Minh. Here are some examples, as I said, here are some examples of names and faces of Vietnamese movement and uprisings, leaders of movements. I'm not going to talk in details about any of them, but the reason why I want to bring them up here is often when people talk about the August 1945 August Revolution, they tend to just see the picture of Ho Chi Minh himself and other people such as Vo Nguyen Giat, the general, the famous general. Rarely do they see other historical figures, Vietnamese historical figures, who were as prominent, if not more influential, in terms of influence, having an influence on people such as Ho Chi Minh himself. So, for example, these are leaders of multiple different movements in the mid 1800 to late 1800. For example, the Can Vinh movement right in the center right here, as you can see here, is a widespread Vietnamese insurrections from 1885 to 1889 against French colonial rule. The emphasis was to make Emperor Ham Nghi here an independent leader of Vietnam by overthrowing the French. The movement was more local. It was rising up within different provinces throughout Vietnam, as opposed to having a central national structure, right? And initially it was succeeding a little bit, and then over time, the French defeated it, and by 1889 it completely faded out. So those are some of the movements, and these movements mainly prior to 1900 were focusing on restoring the rule of the Nguyen dynasty, the Vietnamese last dynasty. They were still ruling, but they were ruling under the French control, right? And so these movements were mainly to reestablish the Nguyen dynasty's control. However, by the 1900 to 1945, things have changed. A lot of new intellectuals and revolutionists began to demand for and want to revolutionize Vietnam in the modernizing sense, modernize Vietnam, right? So these are some features, some faces, some other faces that are very influential, especially the first two, as you can see their faces here, Phan Bội Châu and Phan Châu Trinh. These are, Phan Bội Châu was a friend of Ho Chi Minh's father. and was a major inspiration for Ho Chi Minh himself. Same with Phan Chu Trinh. And Lương Văn Can, he in 1907 in Hanoi established a free Tonkin free school. It's basically a school where he's basically teaching students, anyone who basically promoting Vietnamese alphabet instead of the Chinese character that the Vietnamese were using before as an instructional tools, teaching science and hygienes and French, and was basically trying to modernize the Vietnamese population through this school. After 1 year, it was shut down by the French because it was deemed dangerous, right? And then of course, you have other movements too. 1904, Phan Bội Châu here started a movement called the Dong Zu movement, or the Move to the East movement, basically a study abroad movement to Japan, right? To kind of study from the Japanese experience of how to modernize the country, right? So this program went on from 1907 to 1908. 1907, it has like 100 students who went over to Japan, mostly from southern Vietnam, right? It was clamped down in 1908, but this movement played a crucial role in inspiring Vietnamese nationalism and setting the stage for future independence movement, even though it occurred 40 years prior to the August 1945 revolution. It had a major influence on people like Ho Chi Minh himself. The next is a Phan Chu Trinh, the person right here, and the Duy Tân movement. Duy Tân means modernization or changing, new, right? It's a modernization movement, a significant nationalist movement in Vietnam that aimed to promote political reform, social progress, and national independence from French colonial by emphasizing education and enlightenment, right? So this was also a major movement that was also as influential in terms of broadening the nationalist movements that emerged in Vietnam thereafter. And next is the individual. His name is the scholar Trần Trọng Kim, as you can see here. He's a scholar, a Confucian scholar, a historian who in 1920 published this book, this history book called The Essentials of Vietnamese History, or Vietnam Sử Lược, which examines Vietnam's political, social, and cultural developments from ancient times to the early 20th century by analyzing the distinctiveness of Vietnamese civilization. What he's trying to do is reconstruct Vietnamese history in ways that inspire new generations of people to have national sentiment. It emphasizes the role of Confucianism, Vietnamese rulers and the dynasty, as well as the struggle against Chinese domination that kind of have shaped the Vietnamese history, right? And over time, it became a widely studied and influential text in Vietnamese historical studies. It contributed to the promotions of Vietnamese cultural heritage and the growing sense of national identity. And this book is very important in that sense, shaping people's national sense of identity while shaping the understanding of Vietnamese history and culture among revolutionists as well as scholars and readers. And so it influenced people such as Nguyễn Thái Học here, who was born in 1902 and died in 1930. He was the founder of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, the first homegrown revolutionary party in Vietnam, 3 years prior to the Communist Party, the establishment of the Communist Party in 1930. He had already established the Vietnamese Nationalist Party in 1920. In 1930, he led a revolt in Yên Bái, along with his fiance here and his other colleagues. Many of them were captured and executed, as you can see here. But despite being executed despite being suppressed by the French. His fiancée committed suicide the day after he was executed on June 17th, actually just a few days ago. And she committed suicide. But the movement to this very day still inspire a lot of Vietnamese. As you can see this picture right at the bottom corner here, these are Vietnamese American in America, specifically in Washington, D.C., commemorating the date of the year of the date and the month of the execution that occurred in 1930 as a way for Vietnamese to remember their history, their nationalist history. And these are Vietnamese Americans who are doing this in America. And so the reason I just talk about those group of people is because I wanted us, like I said, to recognize that leading up to the event of 1945, the August Revolution, it was not just, the August Revolution didn't just occur in a vacuum, right? It didn't just occur with Ho Chi Minh and with the Vietnamese Communist Party, but it had started years ago, right? Since the arrival of the French, with these movement and these individuals and these different activisms and activities that inspire the next generation, inspire the following generation to rise up against the French. The problem with those movements and how they didn't become successful was because they didn't really have an opportune time when the French were weak enough that they can capture that moment and win power, right? 1945 was different, right? Why was it different? Well, because we have World War II, right? And so the circumstances that led up to Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, or the success of the 1945 August Revolution, began with the kind of the Japanese occupations of Vietnam in the early 1940s, right, during World War II. That basically weakens the French rule in French Indochina, specifically in Vietnam, allows for many of the nationalist movement to kind of rise up and come together, right? They saw this as an opportune time when specifically the French were weakened, both in France and in Indochina. The Japanese were fighting against the Allies, right? And Japanese exploit of Indochina really caused many problems. For example, this picture you can see here caused a major famine in 1945, where an estimated 2 million people died as a result, which caused a kind of a negative sentiment against the Japanese, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that by 1945, as a result of World War II and what happens with the Japanese takeover of Indochina, specifically in March 1945, when the Japanese overthrew the French and handed power over a little bit to Emperor Bao Dai and Chan Chong Kim, the scholar that we mentioned earlier, in April of 1945. It kind of, Chan Chong Kim, under the rule of Chan Chong Kim, he kind of freed up a lot of the communists that were, and also other nationalists that were imprisoned by the French at the time, allows them to come together, all come together during this short period from April to August 1945, right? He freed up the press, allowing the press to print and to advocate and to call upon people to rise up, right? So this was a very important moment in time that was changing power, as the Japanese were taking power away from the French, defeating the French, right? But also at the time when the Japanese were also being defeated, right? In early August 1945, we have 2 bombs being dropped in Japan, resulting in the September 2nd, 1945 surrender by the Japanese forces. So that gave the opportunity for the nationalists and Ho Chi Minh, as well as the communists, to come up via the Viet Minh to rise up and make the declarations of independence that you guys have discussed prior to my coming on September 2nd, 1945, also the same day that the Japanese surrender, whereby Ho Chi Minh declare and reference the US declarations of independence and highlighted freedom and democracy as the fundamental principle for Vietnam, and asserted that Vietnam's sovereignty free of sovereign domination. So I will stop my first part of the discussion here for a break before we resume for the second part of our talk, where I will talk about the consequences and the reality of society after the revolution.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a really great contextualization of all of this leading up to the August Revolution. Folks, we're going to go ahead and reopen those breakout rooms. And Dr. Taivo, is there a particular thing that you wanted them to consider as they start to process some of this information, or did you just want them to sort of engage in some discussions about what they've learned and how they teach about this topic?
Well, I think the major point that I want to point out is the timing, right? The reason why I talk about the various other movements that occur, did they fall into the right timing, right? And why they didn't become successful as opposed to the 1945 events. And timing is very important. That recognizing the different movements that occur before that, and even at the same time, and the timing that it happens is very important to understand the success of the 1945 revolution, or quote unquote revolution, or coup d'etat that we discussed today.
Great. Okay, great. So there you got it. We're looking at the timing of it, and also just feel free to engage in some discussions that feel pertinent to you and your partner. We're having some questions asked, so we will definitely address those questions during the debrief. Javier and everyone, thank you so much for those comments. We're going to go ahead and open up those breakout rooms, and we'll be in there for, what do you say, Dr. Taivo, 5-8 minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. So earlier I was talking about the context that gave rise to the 1945 August Revolution, as we know it, and how I stressed the importance of understanding the context of when the August Revolution occurred and the timing of it, the opportune time that allows for the nationalist movement to be successful in 1945, led by Ho Chi Minh, as well as other nationalists and communists at the same time, and that had that international context to it, right? World War II and the effects of World War II, and what happened in France and Europe, what happens with the role of the U.S. in Southeast Asia, as well as what happened to Japan, specifically with the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan in early August, that forces the Japanese to eventually surrender on September 2nd, 1945. Basically, and also specifically this moment, oftentimes we don't talk about, right? The moment, like I mentioned about earlier, that when the Japanese overthrew the French, they gave power over a little to the last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty, which is represented by Prime Minister Chan Jung Kim, the scholar. From April to August, history often don't mention this period often because it's so short and they couldn't really do much. But as I mentioned earlier, it was also during this period where, under the Chan Jung Kim government, he released many of the nationalists, including the communists, from prison. And then he also opened up the press, free of the police, right? And it allows for many of the nationalists to galvanize the moment, to make use of this very opportune time to rise up by September 2nd, 1945. Here, I want to talk a little bit about the nationalist revolution. Oftentimes, when we talk about 1945, the success of the August Revolution, we talk of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, right? at the time it's called the Viet Minh, right? It's a nationalist coalition. And in history, when they talk about this, when they write about this in Vietnam or in America, they often push the other people outside of the context. They push the nationalists out, those who, together with Ho Chi Minh at the time in 1945, came together as a coalition government after his declaration of independence. And that is why you can see that his declaration of independence, it didn't really reference anything communism. It didn't reference the Soviet model or the Chinese at all. Some of you mentioned earlier why I didn't mention anything about China, because at this particular time, Ho Chi Minh and other communists, along with the nationalists, they were working as a coalition, trying to overthrow the French, and also trying to win over the support of the West, right? The Americans specifically. And so they want to present themselves, at least for Ho Chi Minh, want to present himself to be more Western, more democratic, as opposed to someone who had been trained under communist Comintern International for 15, 20 years prior, right? And so this movement was important because it was a nationalist revolution from 1945 to 1946, recognized it as a nationalist revolution that was very spontaneous, right? It wasn't really well organized at all. It wasn't really led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party. They actually anticipated that this was going to carry out longer, would take longer to win over. They didn't really realize that there was going to be some bombing in some atomic bombing dropped in Japan that led to that abrupt surrender that allowed for that opportune time. And so when they came together to put together a government, the communists were not strong enough to stand alone and to put together this government. And so they had to work with other nationalists, like I said, other nationalists that came from the Nationalist Party and other political parties to establish this new government, even working together with the former the last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty, working together with other nationalists, not simply communists. And this was important. This was an important moment because this allowed them to later create the 1946 Constitution, which I will talk a little bit about. But it was a moment of compromise where the communists, Ho Chi Minh, and the nationalists compromised each other, right? Rather than imposing upon each other certain ideals, they were compromising each other. It wasn't until the late 1940s, about 1948, 49, when the success of the Chinese Revolution under Mao Zedong in mainland China, that allows for the radicals within the Communist Party to begin to ousting all the other nationalists that participated in this revolution. So when we talk about the August Revolution in 1945, do recognize that the nationalists, other Vietnamese who were not communists, also play a significant role in this revolution. But for some odd reason, through history, they are not being talked about anymore, either in Vietnam or by Western scholarship, because it's convenient. It's convenient to move them out of history so that there's this one narrative of success led by this one individual and his party alone, right? So I urge you to recognize this when talk about this period and these other groups of individuals. Next is the 1946 Constitution, and a representation of this is the 1946 Constitution when they come together as a government, as a national assembly that constituted both communists and nationalists. The people came together to draft this Constitution, or they created this Constitution after the French Constitution, since it kind of adopted the semi-presidential system that the French had, right? The Constitution allowed for multiple parties to participate in elections, and the president had the executive as the executive head of power. For example, it recognized basic rights of citizens, such as the right to own property, freedom of business, as well as the right to petition and to make complaint. These are essential rights that were given in the 1946 Constitution. Why? Because the nationalists and the communists were compromising each other to produce a very liberal and democratic constitution. Even though it had many flaws, it was much more liberal and democratic than any other constitution that comes after, specifically the 1959 Constitution, when all those rights were taken away from the Constitution. And so I would like you all to recognize this point, that is very important as the post-Declaration of Independence, post-August Revolution's reality in Vietnam, when those rights starting to evaporate and being taken away from the people as the radical side of the Communist Party began to take power and ousting most of the other nationalists, those who oppose them or have different views in terms of how to build a nation post-colonialism, right? And this point is important. Why? Because oftentimes when we talk about Vietnamese Revolution, we talk of it as though the post-colonial period as though it is only a vision of only one person or one organization or one party. It is not. It is a visions of multiple people, similar to America. Different people have different views in terms of how they want to build and construct a new nation, right? Be it more liberal, democratic, republic, or whatnot. And so we need to recognize that. The importance of recognizing it is because most of those perspectives and those individuals are ousted from history. And oftentimes we don't see their faces in history at all. Next, I would like to talk a little bit about the First Indochina War, Dien Bien Phu, and the Geneva Accord. We don't have to be long with this, but after the revolution, the new government under Ho Chi Minh couldn't negotiate with the French. And what happened? The French came back to Vietnam and started a war, right? The First Indochina War occurred from 1946 to 1954, right? Where the French fought against the Viet Minh, which encompassed the communists, the nationalists, and multiple groups of people fighting against the French, not just the communists themselves, but were led by Ho Chi Minh and the communists, right? The war ended in May of 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, when the Viet Minh were able to defeat French forces at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, leading to the Geneva Accords in July of 1954. Basically, the Geneva Accord divided Vietnam into two halves. The northern at the 17th parallel, right? As you can see with the map there, the northern half, the pinkish part, became North Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam, which was controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, ruled under the Communist Party. The South was controlled by first Emperor Bao Dai, and then later Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, who later became, in 1955, became president of the Republic of Vietnam, which we know as South Vietnam, that later the Americans supported, right? Which led to the Second War, right? The Second Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. So this divide and this war is very important because of how it shaped the next war, right? But how was this war fought, and how were conditions, how were things occurring under this war? Well, in order to fight this war against the French, in order to win this war against the French at the time, the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh adopted communist policy and models from the Chinese, specifically from the success of the Chinese Revolution in 1945 under Mao Zedong. So they adopted something called land reform in Vietnam. Basically, for them, in order to send troops out into the battlefields, into Dien Bien Phu to fight against the French, for them to muster enough resources to feed the troop, they need to carry out something called land reform. Basically, taking land from the rich and land-owning class and give it back to the poor. But understand that at this particular time, Vietnam didn't really have a lot of land ownership. So what happened is they persecuted a lot of the elite, the rich class, and the in much of northern Vietnam as a way to overturn the countryside and give power to the Communist Party. So the first person that they decided to carry this land reform out and to execute was a person named Nguyen Thi Nam. And she was known as the mother of the resistant. She was the one who, during the war against the French all the way up into 1953, had hosted Ho Chi Minh and his comrades, had sheltered many of the troops. Her two sons here grew up to be officials within the Viet Minh. But by 1953, when they carry out land reform, they picked her as the first person to be persecuted and to execute, as a statement to other landowners that they were going to carry out this revolution in the countryside. And here you can see the proximity in a picture between Ho Chi Minh in red and her in yellow. What happened with this land reform is that it committed great atrocity whereby over 70% of the people who were categorized as landlord were wrongly categorized. 70% of people were categorized. Every 1 in 1,000 people were supposed to be landlord, meaning they were supposed to be incriminated and or executed. That's just to show you what happened after the revolution, the August Revolution that we come to know of. This led to many people become fearful of the government, of the regime, and them fleeing North Vietnam in 1954, when after the Geneva Conference or Geneva Accord, there was a grace period of 300 days when people from the South and the North can move to wherever they want to relocate and resettle. So a lot of people moved from the North. About 1 million people moved from North Vietnam down to South Vietnam during the 1954 exodus. About 100,000 people moved from the South to North. Most of those were communist agents who moved from the South up North. So what happened with this movement is that it balanced the population between the two sides, the North and the South. It gave the North about 14 million. It gave the South about 13 million people. And this became crucial because supposedly by 1956, there was supposed to be a general election to reunify the country. This never occurred, but it's important to understand that movement. Something also occurred in 1956 was a group of intellectuals in North Vietnam under the communist regime came up with 2 journals, Nhân Giải Phẩm, which is masterpieces, and Nhân Văn, which is humanism. Basically, they came up with these two journals demanding for freedom of expression, to creative freedom, so that they can write more freely. Prior to that, the government demanded that artists and intellectuals right to promote the war against the French, right to promote the land reform, right? So this was after the end of the war against the French. Many of the intellectuals felt that we are now free. So can you please give us back our freedom and allow us to write about love, about flower, about sadness, about poverty, about the reality of life, as opposed to just war and fighting and socialist ideals. And so what happened is their demand immediately were crushed and were put down after a year, right? And many of them were imprisoned for as long as 15 years after that. It was from this point on until now, many Vietnamese have lost the freedom of expression, the freedom of press ever since from 56 all the way to now. And so this is also important because by 1959, the communist regime under Ho Chi Minh drafted a new constitution, the 1959 constitution, whereby they take away all those freedom that I just mentioned earlier that were given in the 1946 constitution. And the party at the end of the day have the power, the authority over all matters, as opposed to before, whereas the people have the right to make complaints and whatnot. Now all that returned back to the hands of the party and the political bureaus, which is the ruling community within the party. So this is essential. And this is essential because 1959 was when the Communist Party decided that they were going to escalate the war against the South Vietnam. Oftentimes, when we talk about the second war, the Vietnam War, people often talk about the escalation of American troops into Vietnam in 1965 as the rise of the war, without taking into account the 1959 decisions by the Communist government to escalate and send troops down to South Vietnam in 1959. And this was important for why they created the 1959 Constitution, taking the freedoms and power away from people, because this allowed them from then on to control and to monopolize the North in order to mobilize people to send down to South Vietnam to fight the war that we know as the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War, there's a lot about the Vietnam War that I don't have to go into. As I highlighted here, we need to recognize the 1959 escalation, the period that the Vietnamese Communist Party decided to authorize a people's war against the South as a major turning point in terms of how they turned how the war was turned around and fought beginning in the 1960s, but also a major turning point in North Vietnam society in how the North began to rule North Vietnam and clamp down on people in terms of their freedom of expression, the press, freedom to protest. From then on to now, people don't really have the freedom to protest, for example, or for example, the freedom to write about a protest in China, as I demonstrated at the beginning of the talk. And so the war ended in 1975, as we know of it, right? The fall of Saigon and the Republic of Vietnam in 1975. So what happened after that? A lot of the people who were associated with the former republic, like my father, were in prison, was sent to concentration camp, or it's called re-education camp. So my father was an official then. He was sent to re-education camp for 7 years to be re-educated. Books were burned, right? Literature produced in America, translated into Vietnamese, were burned because they were deemed as unacceptable. Music, rock music by the Beatles, by Elvis Presley, were burned, were destroyed under campaigns that destroy these cultural products because they were deemed as bad for the people. Harsh policies such as economic policy, anti-capitalist. So where they were taking houses from capitalists, from the rich, similar to how they took land from the rich in the North. They took houses. For example, my family's houses were taken away, forcing my mother and my siblings to go back to the village, to live in the village, for example. So all these economic and political discriminative policies forces many people in the 1970s, late 1970s and early 1980s to the mid 1980s to flee the country via what is known as the boat people, right? Such as Witt's family or my family. You cannot have long hair in post-Vietnam, post-1975 Vietnam. That's why you see here a communist agent cutting this guy's long hair. You cannot wear bell bottom because those are considered Western ideals or Western styles that are not acceptable in Vietnam. And so they were prohibited. So these are just some examples of society after 1975, when the whole of Vietnam was unified as one. And as contemporary as just this year, or in 2019, this individual, her name is Pham Doan Trang. She is a Vietnamese journalist, a political activist who was born in 1978, if I'm not mistaken, who had been heavily involved in advocating for free speech, human rights, and democracy in Vietnam. She gained national attention in Vietnam in 2012 when she helped launch an online campaign called I Am a journalist in response to the government's crackdown on independent media. In 2020, she was arrested and charged with creating and storing and disseminating information and documents against Socialist Republic of Vietnam under Article 117 of the country's penal code. So the current regime right now, the communist government under right now, they use this penal code, or this article 117, as an article that they basically incriminate most people who speak up against the regime or who demanded for freedom of speech or freedom of human rights, or even against climate activists. Anything that they deem as a threat to the nation and the people, they put it under Article 117 and arrest them. And I think it was last year she was sentenced to 9 years imprisoned. And as a result, for example, in Vietnam right now, among the 180th countries, Vietnam is ranked as, in human rights, is ranked as number 117, and it's ranked 170th out of 180 among free press countries. So those are the reality of Vietnam now. And so I will end my talk there with those kind of contemporary events as a way for us to kind of understand and evaluate the August Revolution, what happened in 1945, rather than seeing it as an isolated episode by a group of people or represented by an individual. We need to contextualize and understand the history that caused it or that led to it, the different groups of people that were involved that led to that moment, but also the consequences and the reality of society of Vietnam after that, to really evaluate that quote unquote revolution that we talk about or that we teach our students, right? 80 years after the declarations of independence, almost 80 years, Vietnam is certainly a sovereign state. It's certainly under control of one party, right? But how come people in Vietnam to this very day still don't have the freedom to express themselves or the freedom to write about a story, a protest that was occurring in China, or the freedom to protest about climate change, for example? And that, I think that reality is something that is, I think it's important to understand history, because history doesn't sit alone, it affects us and how we carry out our lives to this very day, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I chose to talk about the 1945 August Revolution in that lens, in ways for us to understand the past, but also the present. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Taivo. Let's all give Alex a round of applause, emojis, or you could unmute. That was really great. We're also excited to move into our model lesson, but we saw some questions in the chat. We have a limited amount of time for this, so I'm thinking, Vanessa, you can give me thumbs up. 5 minutes for Q&A. Okay. So folks, this is a good time if you want to ask some of those questions in the chat, to unmute and ask Dr. Taivo. We have an expert in the house. Min had a few questions here, Alex. I can go ahead and unless you want to unmute.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Dr. Taivo. Thank you for the presentation. Very informative. Thank you. Appreciate it. Just wanted to ask you your take on when did you see in Vietnam's history their deviation from the independence movement and the calling out of imperialism and the rise of the Vietnamese nationalism deviate from the repression that you mentioned that's going on right now? When did you see that happening? And do you see it as a bigger movement that just happens to occur in all authoritarian governments, or do you see something specific and unique about that?
I think a great question. I think it's a combination of both. Right. The Communist Party to this very day, as they rule Vietnam, continued to latch onto this narrative of a nationalist independence movement. Right. Even though they no longer are fighting a war against a foreign aggression such as the US or the French, right, since 1975 or since the late 1980s against the Chinese with the border wars against Cambodia and China. They still every year whenever there's a commemorations of the 1945 August Revolution, they broadcast and they parade and they talk about the nationalist movement as in how they led the independence movement. And this is important because I think in the article that I sent out I asked you guys to read by Professor Tun Vu, he made this argument, whereas after the fall of the communist or the communist bloc, especially with the Soviet Union and the change in China toward moving, even though in shell it's still a communist state, a socialist state, it's following a capitalist agenda, right? Following the change in the 1980s in these regimes, especially in the early 1990s, the communists couldn't really latch onto that narrative anymore. And so they had to latch back into the nationalist narrative of an independence movement of the party and of the people that represented the people against foreign aggressions that gave freedom to the Vietnamese public. But the great thing about that strategy is that enabled them to then use that against anybody who speak up against them, right? Because they use that as the leverage to say that anybody who speak up against them are enemies, right? Who want to destabilize the regime, the only party that brought freedom back to or independence back to the Vietnamese people, right? And so they use that in Article 117 as a way to as with many authoritarian regimes, they use law, right, against those who speak up, who demand for the basic human rights, because they see these movements or these calls for rights and freedom as a threat to them. Because if the demand for the freedom of press, meaning the demand for new narratives for history or alternative narratives to history, which would shake in that foundation that they have constructed since 1945, and so I think as long as they continue to control power in Vietnam, they will continue to hold on to this narrative and use that narrative against anybody who's willing to speak up against the party state. I don't know if that.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I mean, do you see this as I guess within the context of what's going on right now geopolitically, whether it be in Russia, Hungary, Israel, US right-wing movement, do you see this happening as a economic phenomenon that's going on in the time period in which we live, where we see these types of reactionary type of using history to justify their rule type of governments, or do you see something different and unique about this?
I don't necessarily see anything unique. It's unique because it's occurring in Vietnam as opposed to China or America or Russia. But any institution, all governments do this in one way or another. And for us to look at a history is to look at the degree in terms of how things are carried out. Any of us who take a group of students to Washington, D.C. and go into the U.S. Congress, you will see a large statue of George Washington sitting there with a sword, right? A major. Well, George Washington 230 years ago, 40 years ago, 300 years ago wasn't dressing like that, right? But the American right, government reconstruct him to be someone of a god from the ancient Greek period as a way to establish a long history of a nation when this nation is still very young, as a way of ruling, right? We can see all this being replicated in different countries in different ways, but what I'm trying to say, the strategy is there, and how the strategy is being used by each country varies, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taibo. Thank you. Everyone, let's again just thank Dr. Taibo for the time and the expertise. Alex, we have some additional questions in the chat that if you want to stick around and maybe respond to folks, feel free to. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And we're really excited to see this lesson that Vanessa has planned, but we're going to give everyone a 5-minute break. So it's 11:10 right now. Let's return at 11:15. We'll put some music on. When the music pauses, if you're away from your computer, that'll just be your cue to return. Okay, thank you all so much, and get some coffee.
I have a question for the doctor. Would you recommend, do you have any book other than yours? Do you have any books that you would recommend?
I wouldn't recommend any of my books, to be honest.
Oh, what? You can't say that.
No, I'm just kidding. For this period, I would recommend reading Christopher Gosha's. He's considered the best person about the first Indochina War period and the events leading up to the first Indochina War. He is an American scholar who is very proficient in French and Vietnamese, and a award-winning writer. And so I'll send you some of I'll send the organizers some of the names of the books, and then if they possible, they can send it to you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just don't have the books with me right now.
It's okay. I also would love a recommendation for any books, particularly recommended from you concerning the U.S. presence post 1946, pre-actual war. I'm just curious if you have any recommendations for that time frame as well. Thank you so much.
Definitely, I'll send a list of a few.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Dr. Taibo, if you don't mind answering a question at this point.
Sure.
Did the Vietnamese nationalist leaders such as Ho Chi Minh and some of the others that you referenced in your presentation, were there any overlaps and crossover with the Chinese nationalist leaders of the same time, Sun Yat-sen and others?
Yeah, for example, Phan Bội Châu. I believe he met Sun Yat-sen. If not, was heavily influenced by that, and that's or Nguyen Thai Hop. He established the Vietnamese Communist, not the Vietnamese Communist, but the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, inspired by the Chinese Nationalist Party, right? The KMT. Kuomintang, right? Remember, at this particular time, many of the Vietnamese intellectuals that I mentioned in the second half or in the first half of the 1900s, some of them were able to travel to France, such as Phan Châu Trinh, but he couldn't read French, for example. Most of them were trained in classical Chinese or in Chinese, right? And so they had to reference, for them, it was closer to go over to China to gain inspiration from China and as well as Japan. Phan Bội Châu went over to Japan to learn from and saw the modernization process in Japan, and that's why he established the Dongzhou, the Eastern movement, to Japan. So you can see at this particular time, a lot of them travels within Asia and were inspired by each other. They cross each other, they learn from each other, and they reference each other a lot. And it was also through this period that a lot of Western ideas come into Vietnam via China and and Japan, because they were brought over to China first, right? And then were then translated into Chinese. And then it was through these that the Vietnamese were able to read in Chinese, read texts by Enlightenment philosophers about freedoms and democracy and republicanism, for example. So, for example, a lot of people, when they talk about Vietnamese history, they often talk about Vietnamese communism. They don't talk about Vietnamese republicanism. And even among Vietnamese, when you talk about the term republicanism, a lot of people were like, "What? What is republicanism?" They call the Republic of Vietnam. They call themselves the Republic of Vietnam, but many people don't recognize the term republicanism and how it came into play even before communism. It came into play in the early 1900s, especially with Trần Trọng Kim's Essentials Vietnamese History, Essentials of Vietnamese History, when he began to insert republicanism into history.
Well, there wasn't a Taiwan mainland China division.
I'm sorry, folks. We're sorry. We're
about that.
We're a couple of minutes over. And no. I'm also tracking this discussion, and it sounds really fascinating. So hopefully you all could maybe continue that in the chat. But I do want to make sure that we have enough time for the teaching application of Dr. Tai Vo's talk. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Danny. If you can pull up the hyperlink there on the model lesson, thank you. Yes, I feel like this was such a learning for me in terms of the big holes and the big gaps that I had and still have in terms of Vietnamese history. What I really wanted to do with this was focus a lesson, and I see this as really being a standalone lesson on Vietnam, of looking specifically on what was the promise of the August Revolution. Sort of like in that beginning, what was it that laying out in these documents, what was it that leaders and this coalition of leaders, as we learned, were saying to the people of Vietnam, like, here is what we hope to do as an independent country, and really having students explore this question. If you can move the slides forward, Danny. Thank you. To ground it in our framework, as we know, and our standards, there are too many standards. You can't get to it all. And so I really see this as being a standalone something that can be done as we look at colonialism. The framework specifically calls out and asks us to answer questions of why did imperial powers seek to expand their empires? And how did colonies respond? So I see this as really allowing students to answer and start to grapple with that question of how did colonies respond to colonization? As we dive into and look at primary sources. So in terms of Common Core, we're looking at primary sources. I feel like we can't get away without doing a little bit of writing, but it's fairly minimal. It's mostly about helping students to answer this question and to dig into primary sources. If you can move it forward, please. Thank you. I borrowed this from Dr. Tai Vo and would start here with students, right? I see this as a bigger part of colonization. And so students should have a really good working knowledge at this point of what colonization is, and knowing that, hey, this happened in different parts of the world, Vietnam being one place. And what I want students to gain from here is to really look at, okay, if we look starting in 1859, all the way to 1945, all of those different, as the professor pointed out, all of those different people moving and working towards independence. And so we can see that this isn't an isolated event of just suddenly in 1945, people were like, oh, independence, sure, let's try it. But this is really people building and building and building. And here, I think it's really great for students to kind of to be able to see the names, to be able to see these events, not to spend a whole lot of time on it with students, but for them to get this background information of just like, yes, there were lots of movements, and we're going to look at this specific time and place. And as the professor said, where there was like a crack in the system because of World War II that allowed for this independence movement to really be successful. And go ahead and move forward, Danny. And here I look at centering Vietnamese voices and people speaking about themselves. And so here is a quote that I found. I will let you all read it. And it is a transcription of something that was said during Vietnam television history, and also referenced in the Zinn Project's Rethinking Teaching in the Vietnam War. And so here, to allow students to get a glimpse in, because like I said, it was so hard for me to find information that would be accessible for students, but here to get a glimpse of what was it like to be in that crowd? What did it feel like to be in that crowd? How did this person feel? And so real quick in the chat, I'm going to ask you to please read through this quote and to throw something in the chat of what is this person feeling? What was it like based on this one small account? What was it like to be in that crowd, to listen to Ho Chi Minh give this declaration, this proclamation? So I'll pause for a second to let people respond. I'm seeing the words hopeful, I'm seeing the words included, I'm seeing the word unity, a united nation, inspired, being one. The in quotations, Uncle Ho spoke their hearts, this feeling. These are some of the feelings that I think we heard a little bit yesterday as we were talking about how youth were responding to the very beginning of the Arab Spring as well. But I would want promise, optimism. I would want students to be able to look at this, to really, yes, power with, right? This moment of unity, this moment of like, yes, solidarity, to pause to let students through this one really pretty easy to access quote, to start to put yourself there of how these folks are feeling in this moment. I have both links there as well. In the link of Vietnam and television history, you can hear the man, you can hear this doctor talking about this in Vietnamese with translation. So you can hear in his own words, him remembering what this moment was like. Go ahead and move forward, Danny. And one more time, in my digging, and we're going to listen to this in just a second. In my digging, I found this really awesome album and it's very hard to tell if this is Ho Chi Minh in his own words, or if this, I'm gonna look at my notes so I can say, hopefully get this name right, if this is Phu Thai Deng speaking, but it is the recitation of the proclamation that we read earlier. Danny, if you can play that, please. We're just going to listen to a few minutes of that. A recitation of this proclamation. This is an album that's produced in the United States in 1976. Go ahead.
All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement appeared in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, it means all the peoples of the earth are equal from birth. All the people have a right to live and to be happy and free.
And go ahead and pause right there, Danny.
Good.
It goes on to give the Hope Proclamation, and we'll have to do more digging to figure out exactly whose voice it is. Like I said, it credits two different people for being the voice that is speaking there. Maybe somebody out there knows. But again, just a way to really bring it home for students of what is being said, of what this moment was like. Again, this is not a recording of 1945. This is, interesting enough, a recording that happens in the United States that is put out by Barbara Dane in 1976, who was a folk musician, all of different speeches and different things there. It's pretty interesting to go ahead and take a look through. You can find that here, and it is also the Smithsonian Folk Waves I'm forgetting my words there. But go ahead and move forward, Danny. Oh, there we go. Thank you. And that, no, you're good. Move forward one slide. Thanks. And that would bring us, so that would be all of the setup for students to really get them there, to get them starting to think about this. And then where we would go from that is to do some digging into primary sources. With students, I believe that I would use the proclamation itself. For us today, I suggest that we take a look at the 1946 Constitution, since we looked at the other document earlier today. The Constitution's language is fairly straightforward, and it is actually pretty easy to read. I would chunk this with students if we were looking at that, and have different groups of students either working in pairs or working in groups to take a look at one chunk of this, keeping in mind that we're trying to figure out what was the promise, what was it that was laid out at the beginning of, like, this is what it means for us to be independent, this is what it means for us to respond to colonialism and to move towards something different. We would look at either the C6 or the C7 graphic organizers to be able to access this information, to be able to take a look at that information. And so what we're going to go ahead and do, and what we're going to go ahead and do is I'll have folks go ahead and I'm looking at the time here. Let's take 10 minutes, go ahead and just turn off your camera, open up that 1946 Constitution, open up that graphic organizer, take some time to take a look through it, skim through the Constitution or focus on one section. A lot of those questions that folks were asking earlier of, does it address women? Did it address religion? Did it address that? We can really go through and take a look at what was actually addressed and what was actually there. So we'll take just 10 minutes, cameras off, go ahead and explore this graphic organizer and that 1946 Constitution.
Just a fun fact, I think we had displaying a playlist of songs produced pre-75, so prior to the end of the war in South Vietnam. So all these songs after 1975, for a period of like 20 to 30 years, were not allowed to be sung. Some of them to this very day still are not allowed to, such as the song before to this one. It's an anti-war song that basically questions that our history has 1,000 years of fighting the Chinese, 100 years fighting the French, and 20 years fighting each other, a civil war. Because of that line, it was prohibited to this very day. And the singer who had just returned from America to Vietnam and tried to sing that last year, and she was prohibited from having another show in Vietnam. So it's rather unique in terms of
So does somebody decide which music is allowed to be played and performed then?
Yeah, they have a under the communist rule. Currently, they have a kind of like a Ministry of Culture and Arts and Sports that come out with these laws every now and then and would allow singers to sing certain songs and allow what songs to be sung and what are not permitted. And so every now and then songs that were produced under the Republic of Vietnam are usually not allowed to. If there are a song that talks about soldiers or the war, for example, soldiers of the Republic, or an anti-war songs. Because I understand at this particular time in North Vietnam, you cannot express as an anti-war sentiment. In South Vietnam, you can. And that's why composers were writing anti-war songs too. And the southern government allowed for those songs to be played, but not the North.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Taivo. We're going to jump into breakout groups in pairs for you to be able to go ahead and debrief your exploration of the 1946 Constitution and how we might use this C6 or C7 graphic organizer with students to help them take a look at that. If you can go ahead and jump into your breakout groups, and then we will to take a look at the questions of what surprised you, how could you use this with students, what in addition would you need to be able to support students to look at these things?
Really quickly, I have a question. Can you go ahead and answer Min La's question, because it's in relation to the Constitution? And I would really like to know that too, for like lesson planning sake. Did you hear me? Oh, okay.
I saw that question. So were there structural deficiency in the Constitution that prevented the rival political parties and ideas to participate in the government? Yeah, I mean, the Constitution has its flaw too. I mentioned that, you know, it was a Constitution that was kind of like a compromise Constitution that were advocating for a lot of the values that we now, let's say in America, share and recognize, right? As opposed to the later Constitution in 1959, 1980, and even the 2013 Constitution that was recently put together. However, it was more at that particular time when the dynamic of the politics changed in 1940, 48, 49, especially with what happened in China with the rise of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party winning over power in China, becoming the model for radical communists to use power and use violence to oust the nationalists, the other people from the government.
Thank you.
Okay, breakout rooms are open.
Vanessa, can I ask a question? So the graphic organizer, like the C6 and the C7, is it a planning tool, or is it like a lesson in that you put activities and you sort of lay out what you want to do?
So the way you would use it is you would use it in conjunction with the primary source. So I'm looking at the primary source, and so I'm looking at the 1946 Constitution, and then I'm looking, okay, so I'd start at the back. Okay, I'd read my section of that, and I'd start with, okay, what's the inquiry question? Okay, the inquiry question is, what's the promise of the August Revolution? Then content, okay, what's the main idea in this? And I would bullet point or write out, here's the main idea that I think that I see or my group finds in this. Okay, citation, who's the author? Okay, the author of this was a coalition of people who were writing this in 19. That's how you use it.
Okay.
So it is the tool.
I see that for C6 as the primary source analysis. Is the C7 a little different?
The C7
is the same concept.
Same
The C7
concept.
is also a reading analysis tool. But what we've done with that is we took the 6 C's and we're trying to, for lack of a better word, update and elevate as well in terms of thinking about ethnic studies and power relations. So we added a couple of other questions there in connections to today.
All right, folks, welcome back. Folks to either come off mute or to drop things in chat. Anything that surprised you about this? Any other ways that you feel that students would need support to be able to access these primary sources, support that they might need in understanding how to use the C6 or the C7? We'll give a minute here for people to give any feedback. And I hope we did see that the answer to those questions is that yes, it did include freedom of religion. This constitution, it lays out freedom of belief. And yes, it does give a certain amount of rights to women. It right in there in the constitution, it granted women voting rights to any person over 18 years old within the country of Vietnam. All right, I'll go ahead and move into this last piece. Again, 10th graders, I feel like you can't get away with not writing something. And so here, because the meat of this lesson really is about accessing that primary source, because the meat really is about trying to understand that primary source, the writing piece is fairly limited. And what I would want students to do is to answer the question, what was the promise of the August Revolution? They'd be creating a thesis. So they'd start with their 3 claims, laying out, okay, here are 3 things that I see that is promised, or 3 either specific things or 3 different themes that are promised. How that would be, how you can then putting it into the Chickenfoot graphic organizer. And that last final thing would be about creating a thesis, one strong thesis that talks about, that would say the promise of the August Revolution was all of those 3 things. And so here would be where folks would end. And I'll pause there. I'd love any feedback that folks have about this. Feedback that anybody out there has over this lesson, ways that this can be used. So Javier, that C6, it just asks you if you'd like to make a copy, but it should allow you to make a copy. I'll go back in there and check to make sure. It doesn't come up right away. It does ask you if you can make a copy. Yeah, the Chickenfoot thesis, I had never, it's something that is new to me, but it is something that I really like as a really interesting way to get students to access and how to write a really clear thesis. Thank you so much. And I'll go ahead then and we're hearing the importance of primary sources. All right, I'll go ahead and then hand this back to Danny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for another terrific lesson. We have that in, we shared that in the chat, and we're going to definitely link that to the agenda. But as we conclude this workshop, we want to make sure that we just remind you of the book opportunity. Again, in the sign-in sheet, there was a section for you to let us know if you wanted the book and what your address is. Again, the caveat is that you attended all 3 days and that you complete the final evaluation, which we're going to share with you in a second. And actually, those of you who have the agenda, we have a couple of evaluations. Ours is very quick. So if you're on the agenda and you click on the evaluation today, quickly fill ours out, and then we're going to have a larger one for you to fill out. But I'm going to let Amparo talk a little bit about this great learning opportunity.
Everyone, I've been sharing with you. I'm really excited about our Sources of Justice in Films series. There is a teacher institute. A couple of you have asked if you can earn credits through this institute, and I thought that was a great idea, and we're working on it. It's a free institute. We will be showing the films then, and then we will be talking with the creators of the films, and just like this workshop, thinking about lesson application. So please join us. It'll be July 14th through 16th via Zoom. And the next one, Danny?
Thank you, Abs. Yes. Let me get my mouse over here. There we go.
I talked to you about a teacher-author lunch possibility. The Western Historical Association is really trying hard to bring teachers in to meet, to talk with scholars, historians. So they would love to invite teachers to sign up for a teacher author lunch. You will get one of the 3 books there. And also they want to let you know, you guys, I don't know, conferences are $200 sometimes to register for. They're offering a teacher registration for $40. So please consider coming to this conference. We're trying to build connections between scholars, historians, and so we invite you to sign up for the lunch and also invite you to attend.
Thank you, Amparo. I'm going to go ahead and go back to this to give the link to everybody to sign up for Sources of Justice. Here we go, folks. So both of these links are in your chat. We encourage you to sign up, take advantage of these great opportunities. And then finally, just keeping in touch with us. Our emails are here. You can scan that QR code with your phone to bring up our link tree, which will take you to our website, YouTube channel, and et cetera, et cetera. Thank you so much once again for participating in this 3-day workshop. It was a very engaged group. We really were thankful that everybody was as engaged as they were, and in the breakout rooms and asking questions to our scholars. And we're really looking forward to seeing and hearing about how this content for these 3 days is integrated into your classroom. So please let us know if you use one of these lessons or sources to revise a unit of instruction. Again, we want to provide students with a world history curriculum that sort of goes beyond the traditional European focus and is more reflective of the students in our classrooms here in Southern California.